this excuse me, this forum. This is the first time I'm actually here at President University. It's not my first time in Jakarta, although the last time I was actually in Jakarta was a long time ago. So this is actually a more than welcome visit for me. I was asked to talk about the idea of continuity and change in Philippine foreign policy under the Duterte administration. And you're probably wondering why I have a slide there that talks about the South China Sea. Simply because if we're talking about change as far as the issue of Philippine foreign policy is concerned, it actually revolves around this question of the South China Sea. Right? But prior to that, I'll actually give you a brief explanation. I think of what constitutes or what Philippine foreign policy is actually all about. I take it that everyone here is an international relations major. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. So that means if I talk about theory, then you have an idea of what I'm actually going to talk about. Anyway, next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. Now, one of the things that is important when we talk about the idea of the foreign policy of any particular country is that it doesn't actually take place. In other words, I think for many of us, there's a context within which we talk about the idea of foreign policy. Foreign policy is something that we discuss in the context of agency, right? That is to say, one particular state intentionally conducts a certain set of activities in pursuit of its own interests, so to speak, right? So we talk about foreign policy largely in terms of what it is that states do in order to actually achieve their national interests. So in that sense, we can actually say that most of the time that we talk about foreign policy, there's agency actually involved. Agency, however, this kind of intentionality takes place within the context of a particular set of conditions. In other words, states in the pursuit of their respective interests actually have to do it in relation to others, right? And in relation to certain conditions that already exist. Most of the time, sorry, the literature talks about this in terms of structure. Hence, you have the structure-agency relationship, right? In the context of Philippine foreign policy, right, the structure that has to be taken into consideration is its immediate environment. In other words, what are the conditions that exist within which the Philippines actually has to pursue its foreign policy. And what I have in this slide is an attempt to actually try to outline what those conditions are. Okay? Number one, and when I say status quo ante, this is the status quo prior to the entry of President Duterte into the scene. Okay? Number one is you actually have a region that is predominantly based on a set of relationships that's driven by multilateral arrangements. Okay? So in other words, you're actually talking about the idea that increasingly over time, okay, Philippine foreign policy, as with most foreign policies in different countries, since the 1990s, has increasingly had to work within the context of an increasingly networked, multilateralized international relations. Okay? Hence, we talk about ASEAN, okay, as one of the things, right? That's to say, we talk about the idea of within the region, ASEAN has been driving multilateralism, the idea of regionalism and so on. You have the second thing that I talked about there, the idea of the Philippines actually submitting a request for clarification. What does this mean? That means the Philippines was actually acting within the context of the context of the existence of a UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. Right? So the convention itself is supposed to regulate the behavior of states in relation to, of course, the oceans, right, the seas. So you're talking about things like, can you claim territory, no? Can you claim territory that is actually based on water, no? And of course, what the UNCLOS basically tells us is that you cannot, right? That to a large extent, when you talk about the idea of maritime domains, no? Any claims, no, with regards to maritime domains are always based on land, right? So, water domains are only extensions of their land territories. Now, that's the basic or the fundamental point when you talk about the idea of what the UNCLOS actually tries to regulate. Hence, high seas cannot be claimed by anyone. It is not the property of anyone. Right? It is not the territory of anyone. Okay? And so, that's why the South China Sea issue has become such an important concern. Okay? And so, in this context, Philippine foreign policy has revolved around its relationship with China. And I'll explain to you later on why this is actually interesting. Okay? The entry of Duterte has fundamentally, or at least the argument goes, the entry of President Rodrigo Duterte has fundamentally changed the nature of Philippine foreign policy. Okay? The idea behind this is simply because he shifted the alignment of the Philippines from the United States to China. In fact, one Philippine scholar has argued that there has been a pivot to China that has been conducted by the Philippines under Duterte. Okay? Which of course raises questions about what is now the relationship between the Philippines and the United States. And this is an important question precisely because the Philippines has, or at least the conduct of Philippine foreign policy, has always revolved around its relationship with the United States. Okay? From its independence in 1946 onwards, until the present time, in fact, the predominant issue as far as Philippine foreign policy is actually concerned is actually its bilateral relationship with the United States. Okay? So to say that there has been a pivot to China raises the question of what has happened with that relationship with the United States. Okay? And then of course, within that context, is that the Philippines is a member of ASEAN. And ASEAN has been an important, with my introduction, ASEAN is an important actor within the context of what the structure around the region is concerned when we talk about international relations. Okay? So there is an argument that the entry of President Duterte to the scene has fundamentally changed, or at least has contributed to change in the way that ASEAN works within the context of the structure of international relations within Southeast Asia. And then of course the question, within all of these things, how do we actually understand the relationship with the United States of all of these things that are actually going on. Okay. Next slide, please. This is a picture. Okay, I'm sorry. It's a little bit blurred, but understand that this is actually a picture that illustrates the overlapping multilateral arrangements, which I described earlier on as being the center point or what we can describe as the nature of international relations in the Asia Pacific region right now. In other words, okay, the predominant, if we were to talk about theory, for instance, the predominant way by which we understand Asia Pacific international relations is to think about it in terms of an institutionalized process, right? Many of us are actually familiar with the idea that realism is the dominant theoretical perspective when we talk about international relations, But in fact, when we take a look at the conduct of international relations in the last 20 years within the Asia-Pacific region, the dominant characteristic has been the multilateralization, that is the creation of institutions, and not just the creation of institutions, but overlapping ones, right? that are supposed to be responsible for economic relations. It's an illustration of how central ASEAN is to this network of multilateralized institutions within the Asia-Pacific region. Okay? Now, so this is the status quo ante, so to speak, right? This is basically how we would actually describe what we might consider to be the international relations with Asia Pacific. Okay? Let's go back to the Philippines then, right? The Philippines is a member of ASEAN. Okay? Its foreign policy revolves around three basic pillars, or at least that's how it describes it, right? Three fundamental pillars. Okay? The first one is of course what everybody actually has as well, national security. That is to say, when we talk about foreign policy, national security is an important aspect of that. The idea of protecting territory, sovereignty, people, right, from the threats that might actually come from overseas. Okay? Second, so here's the point. With security, the idea is to try to exclude others, right? That's the nature of security. The idea of trying to actually create a barrier against threats. The second point, however, is economic relations, right? Now, this is completely antithetical, if you will, to the direction of international security, or when we talk about security. Security is about exclusiveness, or creating exclusion, right? Protecting yourself from threats. Economic relations, ever since from the end of the Second World War, the trend has been towards the idea of opening up borders, right? Reducing impediments, barriers to the entry of goods, services, capital, and to a certain extent, labor, right? So that is to say, it is part of this trend towards economic liberalization that we actually find the ease of movement across countries of different that we will find in ASEAN. And within that context, the Philippines, like I said, it's the second pillar of Philippine foreign policy. The participation in this process of trying to actually open up economic opportunities, of actually being integrated into first the regional economy and then a global economy, right? Okay. So these are not unusual things, right? As far as foreign policy is concerned, all countries, I think, would actually help them, as key elements in their respective foreign policies. There's a third pillar, however, which I think the Philippines shares with only a few countries. Indonesia would be amongst them, right? And the third pillar has to do with protecting overseas workers, okay? Or at least the way it's actually worded out, in the website of the Department of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines. It's the idea of actually protecting nationals. So it's broader in that sense, but more specifically, the idea is to try to protect overseas Filipino workers from, of course, the problems that they might actually encounter by virtue of the fact that they have to live in a strange place, so to speak, a place that is not normal for them. Okay, but that's all part of what I was talking about regarding the idea of economic liberalization, right? The opportunities for work is now no longer limited to what is available within your borders. All of a sudden, you have the skills, the market is, demands those skills, right? You can actually go overseas, right? So the important thing for most people right now is to make their, to actually improve their skill level so that the demand for those skills are not just limited to where they are. So for instance, when you graduate, for instance, you have to take into consideration that it might just be the case that there are opportunities that are available to you outside of Indonesia. And that is part of what you might be interested in. So these are the three key pillars of Philippine foreign policy, right? So if you talk about continuity in Philippine foreign policy, these three pillars have not changed over time, right? In other words, the entry no, of President Duterte, no, into the scene, okay, does not really matter as far as talking about these different pillars, right? In other words, Philippine foreign policy is still about these three things. Okay? So why are we so concerned then about the idea of change? Right? Where does it actually come from? And what is it that we talk about, you know, when we were talking about the idea of change in Philippine foreign policy and the extent to which President Duterte has actually become a factor there? Next slide, please. This is the geographic area within which that change actually show up, or at least within which the idea of change in Philippine foreign policy tends to actually revolve around. Okay? So the point I'm making is that there is more continuity in Philippine foreign policy than there is change. Okay? With the entry of President Duterte. The main issue, however, is that we tend to focus on change because the change that's actually taking place is very, very dramatic in terms of what it involves. Okay? This is a map of the South China Sea. It actually shows to us, the different lines actually shows to us the extent of the claims being made by the different claimant states. Okay? So the dominant one that you see is the infamous U-shaped line, as they call it, but it's actually much more familiar to us by referring to it as the 9-9. Okay? That U-shaped line is actually the extent of what China claims to be its territory in the South China Sea. Okay? Now, remember what I said earlier on, the law of the sea, a convention that was actually set up, signed in 1982, only allows countries to claim maritime domains or maritime territory that is based on an extension of their land territory. Okay? And what are these extensions? It's actually quite simple. Number one is what we refer to as the territorial sea. Okay? The territorial sea is around 12 nautical miles from your shoreline. Okay? Now you might wonder, why 12 nautical miles? I think some of you might actually know the story behind this, because 12 nautical miles was supposed to be the limit when we, 12 nautical miles is actually part of what we might refer to as common law. In other words, things that have been practiced over time, right? When these kinds of arrangements were put into place, the idea of 12 nautical miles was about the maximum range of a cannon that could fire into one's territory. In other words, any ship, the principle has to do with you can claim territory only, you can claim as your territory only that which you can actually defend or protect. Okay? So which basically means that since cannons actually could fire as far as 12 nautical miles out into the sea, that was the extent of which what you could claim as something that you could actually protect. Okay? That's why that's the limit, and it became the acknowledged limit of what you could claim as a territorial sea. The territorial sea is considered to have the same kinds of characteristics as land territory. Right? It's considered to be part of your sovereign territory. Beyond that, and there are several other small elements, but I'll simplify things. Beyond that, of course, is what we refer to as the exclusive economic zone, right? And that's an additional 200 kilometers, right, from the territorial sea. Okay. Now, the exclusive economic zone is not sovereign territory, right? It is not any country's territory, but you can claim an exclusive economic zone, right, and say that you have sovereign rights over the EEZ. There's a difference between having sovereignty over something, and saying that you have sovereign rights over it. Right? Saying that you have sovereignty over a piece of land or a part of the maritime domain means that it is yours. You can actually claim it as being part of your territory. Having sovereign rights basically means that you can exercise rights that you would normally exercise, within the context of your is the yellow line, that you'll find on the left side, okay? And then you have that small excision that comes out of Brunei, right? And then Malaysia also has its own claims. In other words, there are 4 countries, in Southeast Asia that actually claims part of the South China Sea as either their territorial waters, or waters that they have exclusive economic rights to. Okay? All of them, except for China, have those or make those claims based on what UNCLOS actually requires. That is to say, they are an extension of the land territory. Okay? China, cannot make that kind of claim. Okay? So, next slide please. Okay. This picture shows, I guess, a normal situation, in the South China Sea nowadays, Chinese Coast Guard ship, okay, looking at fishing boats, for the ships of other countries and then guarding them off. Okay. So in other words, that's the thing that has been happening. Okay. Ever since the late or before 2010. Okay. And that has become normal since then. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, why is the South China Sea important? This picture actually shows maritime traffic. Okay, how many ships or the volume of ships that actually pass through it. And these ships are not just any ships, right? We're talking about oil tankers. We're talking about cargo ships, that actually move from the Indian Ocean, going into Japan, China, and wherever else. Okay, next slide, please. This is air traffic, around the region, right? You'll see that there are hubs, in Manila, Bangkok, Singapore, and other places, okay, where the amount or the volume of air traffic is actually quite significant. Okay, so in other words, there's a lot of movement that's actually going on within the South China Sea. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now we get to the heart of it: fishing activities. What you'll find here, is that the light-colored spaces around the coastline, okay, denotes areas where there is extensive fishing activity. Okay, so that means the dark-colored places is where fishing activity is not that much compared to what you find in the coastal areas. So what does that mean? What that basically means is that the areas around the coasts are actually becoming overfished. So what does that mean? Fishermen, and you'll see what is actually more overfished. That's China up there and Vietnam on this side. Okay, that means that the fleet from Vietnam, from China, will be forced to actually move farther and farther into the South China Sea, right? In order to actually increase their catch. Okay, next slide, please. So that was fishing. This is oil and gas. Okay, that's the amount of oil and gas, not reserves, but areas where oil and gas is suspected to be in. Okay, so there's quite a bit, as you can see, around the area between the Philippines, and Malaysia, and Indonesia. Okay, along the coastal area in Vietnam as well. Okay, so in other words, anybody who wants to extract, exploit those resources, will actually have to do it in areas that are actually close to the Philippines, to Indonesia, to Malaysia. Okay, and yet China claims those same areas. Right? So it's becoming more and more difficult to actually do anything around those issues. Next, please. Okay. Right? So, what has happened? Why is the South China Sea becoming important then? The point I'm making here is that it is becoming a venue where Chinese interests are actually being, and Chinese aspirations are actually being asserted. But the assertion then is becoming is leading to some pushback, no, from the United States, for instance, right? So what does that mean? Great power dynamics, no, competition is actually intensifying. Okay, within that context, no, there is ASEAN. Okay, remember the Philippines is a part of ASEAN. The Philippines hope that ASEAN would actually support its actions, no, as far as the South China Sea is actually concerned. Next slide, please. Okay. Sorry, it's a bit small, but this talks about the arbitration case that the Philippines filed before the Permanent Court of Arbitration, no, in 2012, okay, resulting from, no, of course, the issue that the Chinese have actually been keeping the Philippines out of, or Filipinos out of, no, what it claims to be its exclusive economic zone, right? No. China did not participate in that process. In fact, China said that the Philippines had violated, no, the provisions of what was known as the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties, no, regarding the South China Sea. They said before Philippines should have gone to the PCA, the Court of Arbitration, no, the Philippines should have negotiated directly with China first, right? No, the Philippines claims that there is no such provision, no, within the UNCLOS, no, that requires bilateral to proceed, no, the idea of arbitration. Okay, for that matter, it wasn't asking for arbitration on the case of, or the issue of claims. It was asking for clarification. The Philippines was asking for clarification on whether or not the issues being raised by China in fact are, no, with merit. Okay. So in 2015, no, the PCA basically rejected, no, the points made by China. Okay, and went and proceeded with the case. Next slide, please. No? And in July, okay, of 2016, came out with its decision, which basically said that the 9-9 has no merit, okay, and the Philippines, no, or most of the things that the Philippines has actually asked for, no, were actually clarified in its favor, no, by the PCA. Okay, so I only have a few minutes left, but this is all background, right? No? What does this background tell us? This is the reason why relations between China and the Philippines actually just plummeted, no, towards before President Duterte actually came into power. Okay. In fact, the interesting thing is after, no, just before the arbitral award actually came out, China had decided it will no longer talk to, no, the Aquino administration, no, regarding these issues, and will wait for the next president, no, to come in. Okay, Duterte came into power, no, just before the arbitral award actually came out. No, next slide, please. No. Now, Robert Beckman is actually an international law scholar, and for him, no, the decision of the arbitration court was a game changer as far as two things are concerned. The idea of the rule of law as far as maritime law is actually concerned. And then secondly, no, is of course the idea of what we can understand out of, no, the UNCLOS. Next slide. That is until this person actually came into the picture, right? This is President Rodrigo Duterte. No, when he came in, okay, he did a number of things. One, he set aside the case of the arbitration decision, said that this is something that will be raised only at a later date, okay, as far as his administration is actually concerned. Okay. This is where we start talking about the change. But, no, most of us have actually focused on the change because the change aspect is the one that is dramatic in terms of its effects, right? Dramatic because, number one, you have a Philippine president basically turning Philippine foreign policy, or at least the fundamental tenets of Philippine foreign policy, our relationship with the United States, no? And of course, the bad relations we had with China, no, on its head. No? That is where change actually comes in. No? Next slide, please. Okay. So, these are the things that constitutes change. Okay? The idea of realignment, no? The argument that the Philippines was moving towards China, no? And moving away from the United States. No? These are two things that are mutually exclusive actually. You don't have to see them as being the effect of doing one being the effect of the other. Okay? Meaning to say that Philippine relations with the United States, as I said before, no, constitutes the basic continuity of Philippine foreign policy. Okay? That has always been the case. No? And when you talk about the idea of change, no, it's actually changed in terms of the relationship with China over the last 6 years. Just over the last 6 years. No? Let me repeat that. Philippine relations with China has always been good. Okay? Until Aquino came to power, and then we faced that situation over Scarborough Shoal, and until China began to actually become more assertive about its claims to the South China Sea. Okay? So, if we talk about change in Philippine-China relations, it actually occurred during the time of President Aquino. Okay? One could argue that what is happening now is an attempt to rebalance that relationship. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not a fan of President Duterte, but objectively speaking, this is something that we have to actually understand, right? That in the continuity of things, Philippine-China relations has always been generally good. Okay? If we talk about moments in time when it turned, when there was a downturn, there was always an attempt to actually fix it up. The only time that we were able to actually do anything about it was during the time of President Aquino, right? So basically, what President Duterte is doing is to try to rebalance the relationship with China. Okay? If there is any change at all, in terms of what you might understand, what China is actually, or what President Duterte is doing as far as our relationship with China is concerned, is to bring it back to some level of normalcy. Okay? So that's where the change is actually coming from. Next slide, please. Okay? Now you might ask why. Is it simply because he wants normal relations, to normalize Philippine foreign policy? Okay? One of the things that we have to understand about foreign policy, okay, is that even as we talk about foreign policy as being about our external relations, foreign policy is more than often enough an extension of domestic policy. Right? Tip O'Neill, a former Speaker of the House in the United States, okay, actually made the declaration that all politics is local. Meaning to say that when we talk about interests, the interests are always local in nature. When we conduct our foreign policy, it's always an extension of those local interests. Right? So, this is what Duterte mean. I need China. This was actually a public declaration he made in one of his visits to China. Why? Because his domestic policy is all about economic development. And his economic development, or the center of his economic development policy, is an infrastructure development. Right? I was talking to your professor Gibran earlier on, and one of the things that I mentioned was, of course, the idea that when it comes to facilities in the Philippines, it's very expensive. He experienced this when he was actually there. Electricity is expensive, water is expensive, and to a large extent, Wi-Fi is actually very bad. It's slow, okay, and it's expensive. Okay? Why is this? Because infrastructure is bad. Okay? In other words, past administrations have not been very, very judicious as far as trying to invest in these kinds of infrastructure. Duterte has actually put as the center point of his economic policy, of his development policy, the idea of improving Philippine infrastructures. Okay? And you can understand this. If you you want to actually develop economically, that those infrastructure needs to actually be handled, no, in a particular way. Okay? And he needed capital from China. He needed technology from China. No? Hence the importance of what he said was the improvement of relations with China. Okay? Things that you would not be able to access if relations remain bad. Okay? Next slide, please. Okay? Now, has there been any change because of the arrival of Duterte to the picture? 2016 is when Duterte actually became the president of the Philippines. These graphs actually show, no, the series of graphs that we're showing is changes, no, that have actually taken place. No? As you can see, this is the number of Chinese and US visitors to the Philippines. No? When relations between the Philippines and China turned bad, no, there were hardly any tourists coming from the Philippines, from China to the Philippines. But what you can actually see here is that, no, from 2016 onwards, no, there has been a slight, no, movement upwards. No? Next slide, please. Okay. Investments. Okay. Again, a similar upward tick, no, as far as investments into the Philippines coming from China is actually concerned. Okay. Now you might say, okay, so things are actually moving up. There's not a lot actually. If you really think about it, no, the amounts that we're talking about are not that much. We're talking about how much is needed in order to actually build the infrastructure of the Philippines, right? No, but it's an upward tick. In other words, it's starting to move upwards. No? Next, please. Okay. Aid from China. No? As you can see, okay, that's 2017. No? 2018, there was a slight movement. No? But the point here is that there hasn't been much in terms of assistance coming from China to the Philippines, no? Even when Duterte came into power. No? In other words, China is still very careful about, no, investing in the Philippines. No? Next slide, please. Okay. And if you look at trade, okay, trade has increased, but trade has increased because the Philippines is being allowed to buy more Chinese products. In other words, the balance of trade is very much in favor of China, right? Not a lot of Philippine products, but for one thing, we're not really an export-oriented country, no, are actually being bought by or are entering China. Next, please. Okay. Next slide, please. No? So, towards the end of 2018, 29 MOUs were actually signed between the Philippines and China with the intention of actually increasing engagement, no, economically, no, socially, and even in terms of security. Okay. So in other words, there's an increasing engagement, no, official engagement between China and the Philippines. These are the things that actually one could actually argue, no, was brought in by the Duterte administration as far as its foreign policy is actually concerned, right? The improvement of relations with China so that we're beginning to normalize. No? One of the things that I'm saying, I keep on saying it's just beginning to normalize because China has been for decades, no, the number one, number two economic partner of most countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Okay? Regarding the Philippines, no, we're moving in that same direction at this point in time. We're not yet there. No? Japan and Korea, the Philippines. No? Next, please. I'll do this very quickly. So, China is supportive, increasingly supportive of the Duterte administration, especially when it comes to security priorities. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's changing its policies towards the South China Sea. Okay? At this point in time, it still keeps on saying that, you know, it doesn't recognize the PCA decision, okay, and that it still owns, you know, territory, you know, it still asserts its claim to the large chunks of the South China Sea. Next, please. Okay, next. Okay. So now, one thing that's actually being put forward is the idea of joint development between the Philippines and China regarding the South China Sea. Okay. And this has been discussed in the last visit of President Rodrigo to China, which actually took place a few weeks ago. Okay? But the United States is not taking this sitting down. It's becoming more active in terms of trying to get in the way of China's activities, no, as far as the South China Sea is concerned. So, freedom of navigation operations, the idea of actually creating what it was an Indo-Pacific arrangement, no, are all part of attempts on the part of the United States, not only to assert what it was should be a rule of law, no, but more importantly, it's basically an increasing dynamic between China and the United States. Okay? Next, please. Okay. So, you can see that if you look at three players, no, ASEAN, South China, the United States, and China. Now, there's an intensification in the competition between China and the United States. Okay, to which Duterte has actually placed the Philippines in the center of. Okay. As that intensification, as that relationship intensifies, that competition intensifies, the question is, what is it that the Philippines will now face? The United States is still a leading ally of the Philippines, right? But China is increasingly becoming a favored, no, partner, no, under the Duterte administration. No, I keep on saying that it's the Duterte administration because we don't know what will happen when a new Philippine president, no, actually comes in 2022. Okay? For that matter, there are a lot of things that are being said about the health of President Duterte. No? So we're not even sure if he might be able to complete his at the term of his administration. Right? And if he is not able to complete his term, his vice president is actually from the opposition party. Right? And the opposition party has always opposed Chinese activities, no, in the South China Sea. So we're not really too sure what's going on right now, no, as far as that. So what you can see is the extent to which, again, you know what I was saying earlier on, foreign policy, an extension of domestic politics, basically. No? Next, please. Okay. So the problem, of course, that ASEAN can play an important role because of its divisions, no, as far as the South China Sea issue is actually concerned. Okay. Next, please. No? And then, of course, what the U.S. has actually been doing, no, only intensifies not only the relationship with China, but the divisions, no, within ASEAN as well. So for that matter, divisions within the Philippines, no, in terms of what it should consider to be its most important relationships. No? Next, please. Okay. And so, in conclusion, no, what you find, I guess, just to repeat, no, a few points that I've actually been emphasizing. Philippine foreign policy has three basic pillars. Okay, but of those pillars, it is the security pillar which is now driving, no, what we are looking at as far as foreign policy in the Philippines is concerned. In other words, the two other pillars are very, very normal, right? It's continuing at a very normal, regular kind of pace, if you will. It's the security aspect that is actually raising questions about continuity and the question of change. No? And the change is because largely of the relationship between the Philippines and China. Right? That's the foremost aspect of when we talk about the idea of change. No? And that relationship, okay, is not really something that is seen in the context of, or needs to be seen in the context of our relationship with the U.S. In other words, no, being friendly to China should not be seen as, no, moving away from our normal relations with the United States. Okay? And in fact, relations with the United States has continued to be normal. Right? Because the most important aspect of our relationship with the United States is the military-to-military relationship. And right now in the Philippines, the military is still very much pro-US. Okay? No? It's the economic side of things where China is actually playing an increasingly important role. Okay? So, in other words, President Duterte, no, has actually tried to make inroads in terms of improving our relationship with China because of the domestic politics or domestic policies regarding economic development that we believe China is best suited for, no, in terms of being our partner. So, thank you very much.
All right, so we've heard in general like
focus on South China Sea and Philippine rebalancing between the U.S. as well as China. For my part, I would just like to add a few of the substance that may of be interest to this topic. So the first thing that I will do is I will talk mostly about Indonesia-Philippine relations in general, the characteristics of Duterte's Philippine foreign policy under Duterte, and then the prospect of Philippine foreign relations transform into stronger ASEAN centrality, as well as advancing Indonesia's national interests in Southeast Asia. Right? So the first thing that you have to know is that the relationship between Indonesia and the Philippines has always emphasized greater people-to-people contacts between the two. Whenever there is a bilateral talks between the two presidents of the two states, the leaders would always emphasize how the closeness of Indonesia and Philippines as people, right? So an example of this is that when Benito Aquino III was president, he said in front of President Jokowi, who were just a few months into his term, that Indonesia is like Saudi Arabia to the Philippines, right? And Duterte in 2016 would say that Indonesians in the Philippines, this is during a stack banquet here in Istana Merdeka, that Indonesians in the Philippines would be treated the same way as the Filipino citizens. Whether or not he's serious about that is subject to multiple interpretations, but that's what he said. So yeah, another friendly gesture that has happened is that when Duterte came to Jakarta in 2016, he allowed Indonesian Navy to go to Sulu Sea to pursue pirates. Whether or not that agreement still holds until now is still unknown as well. But he is excessively friendly to Indonesia, so to speak, in the beginning of his term, right? And the progress has also been made in terms of bilateral relations. During the 34th ASEAN Summit this year, Indonesia and the Philippines exchange documents on the ratification of EEZ, Exclusive Economic Zone Boundary Delimitation, which has been signed in 2014 by President Yudhoyono back then and President Aquino. So the bilateral relations between the two countries are actually quite amicable and they're quite constructive, right? But this is when it comes to our position with regards to ASEAN centrality and the Philippine position with regards to ASEAN centrality that this becomes an issue, right? So when it comes to ASEAN centrality, the Philippines causing up approach to China, in my view, it doesn't help, right? It doesn't make ASEAN much stronger than it needs to be, especially with regards to our shoal, the Big Bang, etc. Now, the surprising thing is that when Duterte became president, he made shifts in Philippine approach to handle the Chinese Sea dispute, as discussed by Professor Kraft. But one of the interesting things here is that when I was a student in the University of the Philippines Diliman, the discourse of Philippine foreign policy in South China Sea is that you do not resort to bilateral talks with China. Why? Because we are practically minuscule compared to China, right? If we go bilaterally, we would be bullied, so to speak. Now, Duterte changed that. He would rather set aside the South China Sea arbitration decision and go bilateral with China, which is unprecedented. I didn't expect when he would become president that this is the thing that he would do until now, right? The refusal to use the ruling, the arbitration ruling, is also surprising because if you look at the realist lens and if you look at the rational choice theory, state would protect its national interests, but the Philippines choose not to use that ruling to defend its maritime rights, its sovereign rights in South China Sea, right? So this pretty much plays into Chinese hands, I would say, right? Whether or why he is doing this is something that I've been pontificating for the past 3 years, and in fact I had a conversation with Professor Kraft about this, and we could not find any academically sound reason why this would happen, why the Philippines would tone down its stance when it comes to South China Sea. So, Duterte would always make statements like, I cannot go to war with China, this is his exact word, I cannot go into a battle that that I cannot win, right? Which when you think about it, it's an antithesis of realist theory, right? But at the same time, this is what I found is weird also. Duterte complained that ASEAN does not complete its code of conduct on South China Sea faster. But he, on the other hand, is causing up to China. So that's one contradiction that would create question. Why? What is Philippine position with this regards? Does it abide by ASEAN centrality, or does it want to bandwagon with China? Because you cannot have either way. ASEAN centrality is about ASEAN being in the driver's seat, making sure that outside power, external powers does not interfere with the affairs of Southeast Asia, right? So if you bring China into this, automatically ASEAN centrality would win, right? So yeah, there's a contradiction in the foreign policy formulation process when it comes to ASEAN centrality. Now, this is also interesting development. Duterte recently went to Beijing and he raised the arbitration after 3 years of not raising the arbitration. So this is also something that is convoluting at this. Is there a strategy by Philippine Department of State towards South China Sea and ASEAN, right, in this regards? Or is this strategy being contradicted by the president who is the decision-making process? If so, then there is an element of agential intervention into the structure of Philippine foreign policy decision-making process within the Philippine bureaucrats, basically, and technocrats, right? Now, the thing is, this is also something I talked with Professor Kraft. Duterte's policy in South China Sea does not affect his approval rating, right? Even though 90% of Filipino thought that it is important for the Philippines to control the territories lost to China, to get control back of the territory lost to China, his approval rating is still about 81%, which is pretty high, right? It's higher than Jokowi has ever been. I think the highest Jokowi has ever been is 70%, if I'm not mistaken. Right? So I guess there is this personality or charismatic attachment that the Duterte has that appeals to the masses of the Filipino people, whatever it may be. I do not know what it may be, because when I left the Philippines, everything is still rationalized when it comes to the decision-making process at the governmental level. Now, perhaps also another assumption is that South China Sea is not really sexy topic to the Philippine Republic, or even the Indonesian public for that matter, but that really would require future examination. Now, the thing is, if you compare his policy in South China Sea and South China Sea, and his policy on war on drugs, you see a lot of differences. When it comes to the war on drugs, President Duterte is somehow very assertive, right? Different from South China Sea. Okay? Recently, the UN Human Rights Council passed a resolution that would call for the promotion and protection of the Philippines in response to the war on drugs campaign. Duterte called these critics idiots, in quotation, and the Malacanang Palace, which is the Rodrego there, said that those who criticize his war on drugs does not respect the sovereignty of the Philippines. But at the same time, when China encroaches Philippine territorial waters, they do not. So there is a selective bias when it comes to what constitutes sovereignty under President Duterte. And this is something that would need further clarification from Philippine government with this respect. Now, relationship with China is still unknown. Philippines' decision to set aside the arbitration is baffling, to be honest. It's something that cannot be determined in a most rational explanation possible, right? I'm still waiting for the gun with regards to Philippine approach to China. Now, another point I would like to make is that the Philippines is the oldest democratic state in Southeast Asia, right? It democratizes longer than us. We democratized in 1998, right? Now, before in the literature in 2013, 2014, Indonesia and the Philippines has always been labeled as the two major democracies in Southeast Asia. And this is in literature of Japan International Exchange Center. So even Japan recognized that. Increasingly, however, this has changed. This has changed dramatically. Indonesia's representative to ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission of Human Rights, or AICHR, Yuyun Wahyu Ningrum, said at one time in CSIS that Indonesia is now alone when it comes to promotion of democracy in Southeast Asia. Thailand is no longer democratic. It has coup d'etat in 2014, and the war on drugs in the Philippines does not help legitimizing a democratic process in Southeast Asia. This is not good either, because we also need partner when it comes to democracy and human rights promotion in Southeast Asia, right? So the lesson learned here is that Philippines has always been U.S. ally, and Indonesia has always faced as a challenge when it comes to promoting region free from external interference because of Philippine close relationship with the United States. Philippines is an ally of the United States. At the same time, the Philippines' approachment to China does not create a solution to that, right? It does not create a solution to that, and there is a need for ASEAN, not for ASEAN, but there's a need to convince Duterte that ASEAN is as sexy as China, basically, right? Because apparently to Duterte what is attractive is China and Vladimir Putin. At one time he said that Vladimir Putin is his idol, right? So that's the similarity between Duterte and Kraft, I guess, when it comes to Vladimir Putin. Now, when we look at Jokowi's first term as president, he is very narrow-sighted and transactional in his foreign policy, asking what can we gain from having relationship with these countries, with the countries that Indonesia have close relationship with. This changed. Jokowi is now engaging in multilateralism, making Indonesia the non-permanent member of UNSC for 2019 to 2020, right? And also coming up with the Indo-Pacific outlook for ASEAN. Hopefully, Duterte can learn from that and then change its course, right? That it will be more pragmatic in foreign policy rather than resorting to this transactional and short-term thing on what the Philippines can get from having infrastructure, what they call benefit from China. So yeah, hopefully, I would like to, as an observer, I would like to see more clear strategy on the part of the Philippines as to where the country is heading in terms of China and South China Sea and ASEAN, right? Because there's a complexity of actors there, and you cannot just provide simplistic solution. So yeah, in closing, I would just like to say that from Indonesia's point of view, we need strong Philippines, we need autonomous Philippine foreign policy, because that would help ASEAN unite against great power. And hopefully by Philippines would effectively balance US and China, not in a way that it merely drifts its foreign policy priority completely to China, but making sure that it is an honest broker in the middle without depending so much on both actors. You don't have to choose between US and China. That is Indonesia's foreign policy principle, and hopefully that is followed in Manila. Whether or not that is feasible, it is subject to the local politics, as Professor Kraft has just said. So that's all the takes that I can give for Professor Kraft's lecture. I would like to thank you again. Please give an applause to Professor Kraft. I will give the floor back to the moderator. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Gibran, for the discussion response. And now we would like to move on to the next agenda, that is the question and answer session. But first of all, I would like to, all right, thank you for maintaining the quorum. Beforehand, I would like to invite the two MCs to bridge towards the next agenda. Yeah, for the question and answer session.
One by one or one and then answer?
Okay, so we will open, I think, about 2 or 3 batches of questions. For the first batch of questions, we will receive 3 questions. We will collect the questions first before Mr. Herman would later answer the questions.
Very well. Now we'll open for firstly 3 slots. So there are any questions from the audiences? Oh, that's a lot of questions. Okay, which one do I pick? Okay, Kak Feb, Kak Laude, and then Carl. For the first slot would be from Kak Febrian, Kak Laude, and Carl.
March 2017. So I have one question only. So it's actually about, is it okay for us to conclude that Philippines is actually using the competition between US and China to gain the most benefits for its country itself without actually any consequences that need to be considered? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you for the chance. So my name is Rodrego from Pakasa. I'm from class Diplomacy 1 2017. So my coach, thank you sir, for sharing your expertise with us. So as you said on the last of your speech, you said that China's under Duterte tried to have a closer relation with China in order to increasing the domestic policy for economic development. However, in your presentations before, I see that there are already 15% projects that has been approved by China. However, none of that project goes to the pre-construction. It means that there is no giving a benefit and changes to economic development as well as infrastructure. So, what the reason behind that situation? And when this still continue, it means that there is no economic and infrastructure changes in Philippines after all. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Kamal Galing Sayuda from International Relations Batch 2018. My question is, under the Post-Asia Research Incorporated in 2019, most Filipinos remain largely pro-United States and worried of China. And the approval rating of President Duterte is above 80%. Now, looking with the unorthodox stance of Philippines government, if Philippines and China relation is getting better and better, there are a lot of economic programs with China. Now, what my question is, are there any possibilities for the Philippines to get trapped in China's debt trap? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's all for the first slot.
Is the Philippines taking advantage of the competition between China and the United States, which normally we would think any rational decision maker would do. But that presumes that there's intentionality in that, meaning to say that it's a policy to you know, what we refer to that, it's a divide and conquer kind of thing, right? But what actually is happening right now is that different institutions within the Philippines are actually conducting or at least engaging with either the United States or with China. In other words, President Duterte himself is acting as the agent for improving relations between China and the Philippines. Okay, so his actions are directed more at actually getting China to invest more in the Philippines, no? and doing things that might be seen as problematic as far as say the South China Sea issue for the Philippines is concerned, but nonetheless, it's something that he feels is necessary because he wants Philippine-China relations to be normal. Okay, but the relationship between the United States and the Philippines has always been driven by military-to-military relations, right? So in other words, I can't see, I won't say, or I don't think I can actually say that there is a strategy behind this, no, a coherent strategy. What is actually taking place is that different institutions are actually becoming agents for the Philippines in the conduct of its relations, in the conduct of its bilateral relations. President Duterte himself is acting as the primary agent as far as our relationship with China is concerned, right? And one of the things that, aside from the times when he actually curses the United States or other governments that are critical of him, right? He doesn't say anything about them. He completely ignores them, right? So in other words, it's China that he's very proactive with, no? Even ASEAN hardly merits a mention, no, when President Duterte says anything, okay? But no, the military continues to actually maintain very strong relations with the U.S. military, right? So in that context, no, you see that different institutions are actually responsible for the conduct, the maintenance of our bilateral relations with different countries. So I guess that means that I can't say that there's a strategy, no, behind all of this. It's really more of, you know, a laissez-faire system where let these different institutions actually act, no, in accordance with Philippine interests, no, in the conduct of bilateral relations. Okay. Second question is, okay. Why is there no change in Chinese involvement in the Philippines, right? I think that was the question. That despite all of the things that China, Duterte has actually done, no, Chinese involvement in the Philippines, especially seen in terms of economic contribution, has not really, you know, gone up all that much. It's increasing, as I pointed out. There's an uptick in the involvement of China. There are more tourists coming in, for instance. There's more trade going in. There's more aid actually coming from China, and there are more loans, right? The main problem there is that I think this is now a matter of China actually hedging its bets, right? In other words, it understands that. And I think the third question was asked about the popularity of China, in the Philippines, right? That Filipinos remain very, very suspicious of China. So in other words, they know that it's just President Duterte who's actually promoting Philippine-China relations, right? That Filipinos, by and large, aren't too happy about the way that our relationship with China is actually being conducted. So, which basically means that in recognizing this, China is very careful about going all in as far as the Philippines is concerned, right? So, in other words, investments, engagement, is actually being done at a slow, you might say, very rational process, right? That's why you're not seeing a sudden uptick, as far as the involvement of China economically in the Philippines. The third question actually has to do with the debt trap, right? It's a big issue as far as the Philippines is concerned. When we signed those MOUs with the dimension, with China, there was actually a concern that the influx of Chinese capital to the Philippines would put us in the same kind of situation as Sri Lanka with regards to the Hambantota port. There is, however, reassurance on the part of our Department of Finance, right, that our finances are sound, okay, that the possibility of us falling into a debt trap as far as China is concerned, okay, is not likely at this point in time. And I think the slowness, my response to the earlier question, the slowness of the involvement of China in the Philippines economy might actually be an advantage in that sense, right? Because right now, of all the 28, 29 MOUs that we've actually signed with China, there are only three projects that have actually advanced beyond the planning stage. Okay, two of those projects are relatively big ticket items. We're talking about a dam, as well as a dam and can't remember the other one, but it has to do with the river, no, that needs to be redirected, no, for water supply purposes. Okay. Now these are relatively big ticket items, but both of them, no, are nowhere near the amount of investment that was required to fix up Ambatona, for instance, right? So in that sense, we're not talking about a huge amount of Chinese capital, right, or a huge loan, no, involved in these projects. Now, however, no, if you put all of the 29 projects together, right, then it will be substantial. Okay, it's just that at this point in time, like I said, the fact that we're moving very slowly on these projects, it might actually be an advantage as far as that question of the debt tax is concerned.
All right, thank you very much for the first session of the question and answer session. Now we would like to invite another 3 questions for the second batch of questions that we'll be collecting first. If you have a question in mind, please raise your hand. I am your answer.
Good morning. My name is Gibran Mahesa from BA.IR 2017. I want to ask regarding the ASEAN centrality that has been intensely discussed in this presentation. So, you also mentioned ASEAN centrality as one of the possible outcomes of this issue also. But remembering the undecisive nature of ASEAN members in addressing China on the issue, and even for making a joint statement, it takes a very, very long time to do. To what extent do you think ASEAN centrality can play a role on this issue, and do you think it is enough for ASEAN to do this extent? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the host of the event. First of all, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Hendra Manurung. I'm a lecturer of international relations at President University. Well, I would like to deliver the comment first. Actually, this is nonsense about the ASEAN centrality. I think that there is none of the frameworks that can be worked under the ASEAN as we know that ASEAN Charter 2007 also. So I think it depends on the country, state concerns, state national interest. That's my first of comment. And the second one is regarding to the Indonesia leadership. I think that Indonesia leadership, regional and international, also need to be strengthened. As we know that this is not only about Indonesia leadership, but also all the member states of the ASEAN. We know that Indonesia is, I think that 2016, if I'm mistaken, has moved forward against China in the northern Natuna Island Sea. We know that it happens. And also that Philippines also that 2 or 3 months ago also, Duderte said that at any cost, at any, sacrifice, we will challenge China power in the regions. So I think that it depends on the willingness of the ASEAN member state, because we know that ASEAN now is fragmented, is separated. CLMP also, in terms of the climate and non-climate state of the South China Sea. So I think that my question here regarding to the national interest, currently and also in the future, next 5 to 10 years, as we know that this South China Sea will become hot issue, sexy issue in the regions, and also that the intervention, that the contestations between US and China in the regions. So how every state of ASEAN dealing with that, and also that as a member of the ASEAN itself, is there any regional decisions on that? If we just know that this is unilateral actions by other states that can be endanger the interest of the ASEAN member state. and it is very dangerous within the next 5 to 10 years. Agree that need to balance, because this is not only about US, China, but also Russia is there. Okay, I think to all the speakers, I would like to raise about this. I mean, what do you think about that? About Indonesia leadership? That this is unique because Indonesia internally and externally can do that together with the others ASEAN member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Abraham from IR 2018. My question will be, looking at the strategy of President Duterte's friendly stance towards China and quote-to-quote putting aside those South China Sea's problems by not bringing the epitrade, especially in the 2016, in his first visit to China, has secured approximately $24 billion US, and those kinds of cooperations, even though it has been little to be materialized, seeing that Duterte's strategies to panders towards the China's discussions and so on. So my question is that, as it also expected to be resulted into deals, will this strategy hampers the powers of the Philippines in the South China Sea territory in case or dispute, and how will the rest Asian countries involved in the dispute see the stance made by the governments of Philippines? Thank you.
Okay, it somehow moved into each other. The question of centrality is really still important. Should we still talk about it at this point in time? And the idea of isn't this really about national interest, in the end? I agree. In fact, the idea of ASEAN centrality is interesting because one can trace it back to all the way back to the idea of that we have in the both in the ASEAN Declaration as well as the Treaty on Amity and Cooperation. In those early documents, ASEAN's main role regionally, or at least the aspiration, was to insulate the region from great power dynamics. Right? So the idea was actually to try to keep the great powers in there and the kind of relationship that they bring in, which is usually competitive, out of the region. Right? Now, of course, at that time it was difficult because you still had the Vietnam War going on. Right? But that was the aspiration. Right? And that's why one of the things that you'll find in the early documents of ASEAN was a paradox as far as the Philippines was concerned. And this had to do with the idea that ASEAN made a declaration that all military bases or foreign military bases in the region were supposed to be temporary. Okay? Now, for those of us who were alive during that time, the largest military bases in the region were the American bases that were located in the Philippines, right? So in other words, the Philippines was in fact one of those countries that created some sort of dilemma for ASEAN. This changed, okay? This has changed as far as centrality is concerned. This has changed in more recent times, especially when you had the ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN suddenly becoming the driving force behind regionalism and all of that. Okay? In other words, ASEAN centrality, the expression of it had to do with ASEAN now playing a very central role, not only in terms of trying to actually keep, you're no longer talking about keeping great power dynamics out, you're now talking about managing it within the context of the region. That's why you had multiple institutions being created with multiple memberships, right? So in that sense, the idea of centrality was that ASEAN ought to try to provide the mechanism that would try to manage this relationship. Now that's very, very ambitious, if you will, okay? Because the process of trying to manage that relationship actually deals with two things. Number one, okay, ASEAN is about creating a community in Southeast Asia. In other words, The ASEAN community building process involves ASEAN dealing with its own members, no, unifying it, strengthening its solidarity, and so on. At another level, even as it's actually doing this, right? Even as it's doing this, it has to actually try to deal with its partners in the region, right? In other words, this is where the multilateral arrangements that we're talking about comes in. No? So in other words, ASEAN collectively has to manage the region, okay, even as it's building that collective identity or community. That's not an easy process to actually conduct. And so we go now to the question of, isn't ASEAN really dealing with all of these things based on its own national interest? And that's the problem. See, my own take on ASEAN centrality is that the problem with it is that ASEAN, or the idea of ASEAN centrality, is supposed to involve ASEAN dealing with its external partners. Okay? That means ASEAN acting together, ASEAN acting as a collective. The problem is that it hasn't really defined what its strategic interests are. So in things like, for instance, the South China Sea, what is ASEAN's interest there? You've got the continental continental Southeast Asian countries actually saying that this is an issue that only matters to the claimant states. It doesn't have to involve the whole of ASEAN, right? The problem there, at least from my perspective, is that if you're looking at things strategically for the region, right, then that means this is an issue that involves the region. Meaning to say that you're talking about a geographic area, okay, where developments there are going to overspill into the different ASEAN countries, right? So which means that there has to be some sort of strategic position that the ASEAN countries should actually take. But it brings us back to the question now of, do the ASEAN countries have a collective strategic position? No, they don't. Right? At this point in time, the ASEAN states actually look at things from a national interest standpoint. Right? And my problem, really, is that I think as far as ASEAN centrality is concerned, right, continuing to look at ASEAN centrality in terms of external relations, the idea of actually managing the external relations of ASEAN is overstretching ASEAN. At a time when ASEAN probably is not in a position to do that, precisely because you're not really all that unified at this point in time. So what does that mean for me? ASEAN centrality probably needs to be redefined. Okay? Meaning to say that, to me, ASEAN centrality should be seen more in terms of the need for the ASEAN countries to see ASEAN as its national interest. Okay? In other words, the idea of ASEAN as a national interest, not only looking at ASEAN interest and national interest as a binary, right? In other words, looking at it as an either-or kind of situation. I think what the ASEAN member states must do is to rethink this idea of ASEAN centrality in terms of adopting it as part of their respective national interests. The moment you do that, then you're taking those steps towards actually creating some sort of strategic perspective within ASEAN. Now, it's an aspiration. It's probably, for me, it's more of an ideal, right? But if we're really talking about the idea of ASEAN taking those steps, then that's one thing that has to be taken into consideration, right? We have to actually see ASEAN centrality in terms of ASEAN being seen as a national interest, as central to the national interest of the different ASEAN countries, right? Okay. Third question has to do with the question of will Duterte's non-pursuit of the arbitral decision, when it came out in 2016, actually hamper Philippine claims? A number of experts have actually talked about this, and they're saying that there are two things that they're actually saying. Number one, no, is that for the Philippines, no, the non-pursuit, okay, doesn't hamper, okay, but it will weaken, right? In other words, in not actually arguing from the arguing the arbitration, no, strongly from the very beginning, okay, it makes any attempt on the part of the Philippines to suddenly assert it later on, no, actually seem weak, right? You've not done anything on the arbitration decision for a long time, and then suddenly you're actually bringing it out now, okay? So, in other words, that creates sort of a dilemma for the Philippines, or for any administration that follows the Duterte administration, okay? But the second thing that has to be taken into consideration is this: the arbitration decision, regardless of whether the Philippines actually does anything actively at this point, has become part of international law now. The decisions that are made there, no, actually defines, no, or operationalizes many of the hypothetical things that the UNCLOS actually talks about. Like, for instance, what are islands, right? Do islands are low tide elevations, no, considered to generate EZs, for instance, no? So those kinds of things become important matters as far as the decision is actually concerned. Assert this. In other words, any country in the region, or for that matter, no, any country around the world can point to that decision and say, that decision now defines for us what islands are, for instance. No? That decision defines for us, okay, what are traditional fishing grounds, and what are the rights of traditional fishermen in these traditional fishing grounds, right? So it's actually quite fascinating, no? In other words, since it has now become part of international law, China has to deal with it, regardless of whether Duterte raises it with China, right? But for the Philippines, no, not asserting it, no, actually weakens its own ways of arguing things out later on. See? But as far as the law is actually concerned, it's there. No? Anybody can actually use it. Vietnam can use it, no, to assert its own claims, no, in relation to China.
I would just like to respond to the question of Indonesia's leadership. Even though this is not the subject of this seminar, the expectation that Indonesia would be able to, so to say, ensure that ASEAN will and stay cohesive is ambitious, simply, and quite unrealistic. The thing is, Indonesia's leadership operates under the mechanism of quiet diplomacy, wherein we approach each of the member states involved and try to ensure that they are not excluded. So the principle of inclusivity is there, and interpersonal relations, right? Also, another challenge to that is that Indonesia does not want to be viewed as a hegemonic power, right? When ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific was issued, one of the things that Kemlu official said was that this is not an Indonesian Indo-Pacific outlook. This is an ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook. Even though Bu Retno Marsudi campaigned very hard, night and day, for the adoption of the documents, right? So, Indonesia, in the expectation is that they would not likely to assert a more, what do you call it? A more assertive leadership when it comes to ASEAN, but rather go through it in a quiet diplomacy, in talks with the member states involved.
All right. I think we still have some time for another batch of questions, I think.
2 questions.
2 questions. All right. So for the final batch of questions, we would like to invite 2 people to hear their questions. And for your information, I wish the audience could maintain the status of the quorum and respect the speakers who are speaking in the front. Thank you very much. Now for the audience who would like to deliver a question, please raise your hand. Ma'am Jessie? Yeah, okay.
I was alumni of Philippines Diliman side during the time of President Rodrigo Duterte. Those are long time ago. Yeah, so I'm happy for you to be here. It's great to be able to give your insights and opinions on Indonesia's role in maintaining security and consistency and whatever you want to achieve in the region. I would like to ask a question that is non-political, if you may. This relationship that we have with the Philippines and other Asian countries is actually positive in the sense that it's opening a lot of doors for future employment of people in the region. Employment for Indonesians is really important, especially if they go out of Indonesia, because it's the only way by which Indonesians can learn actually if they travel and they work in a global space. However, there are very few Indonesians working in the Philippines. There are quite a number of Indonesians studying in the Philippines, but to stay there is constraining for most of them because of the manpower regulations. On the other hand, there are many Filipinos working in Indonesia, so there's a skew balance in employment. What is the government doing in order to allow Indonesians to work in the Philippines in a way that is the same as we treat Indonesians here, Filipinos here? Yeah. You see, we have all these students and they're all aiming for global space, and Philippines is an area that can be a potential place for employment. We have had about 4 alumni working in the Philippines, but they couldn't stay because of the manpower laws against that. However, in Indonesia, we are now opening many. The recent Ministry of Labor law has opened many doors for Filipinos to come here in banking, in education, in sciences. So I'm just wondering why we have that imbalance. Is it our competency, Indonesian competency, much lower than the Philippines? I guess not. Indonesians are very smart, very talented, but they just couldn't get enough. Thank you.
All right, so we would like to invite another question, the final question.
Is there anyone would you like to ask a question? If none, then just proceed to the remaining question.
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to actually give you a satisfactory answer. Excuse me. The first question was, is the government doing anything? Right? And I think the government is doing certain things that are actually in line with ASEAN. Right? I mean, if we look at the ASEAN Economic Community, one of the things that's actually being promoted there is the idea of the free movement of skilled labor. Right? In fact, we've already identified 8 areas, right? And that these are being targeted for standards homogenization within ASEAN, especially in terms of university degrees, I think, in terms of the training that one actually gets with them. Okay. But you're right, as far as the beyond that, I don't think that the government is actually aware of this. Let's put it this way. When we talk about the idea of labor migration, or the idea of opening up labor markets, the Philippines is interested in sending Filipinos overseas. There's very little interest in understanding the prospect of receiving labor from other countries. And I don't think that it's directed specifically at Indonesians, that it's actually difficult for them. Because if you look at the private sector, there are so many expats that are actually working in the private sector. It's actually in the government sector that I think there are limitations. The civil service still insists no, that civil service positions can only be occupied by Filipinos, right? So, and I don't think that there's going to be change in this particular policy anytime soon, no. But my suspicion is that at the very least, in terms of highly skilled professional positions, no, once we get the ASEAN, all of this homogenization actually comes, then we'll actually see, more movement of skilled workers, coming to the Philippines, for instance. So I wouldn't be surprised if Indonesians will actually start coming in when those policies actually start to kick in. But given how ASEAN actually moves, the speed with which it moves, and then of course bringing in the Philippine bureaucracy as well, this is not something that we would probably be expecting to happen operationally. I'm almost sure that the standards will actually be pushed forward very, very, very fast. But the extent to which this will translate into Indonesians staying, going to the Philippines to study, then staying on there, or Indonesians actually coming to the Philippines in order to work, is probably not going to happen anytime soon. Of course, the other issue that has to be taken into consideration, is simply the eagerness of good jobs that are actually available in the Philippines, right? Meaning to say that the other aspect of it is that Indonesians might not be too keen in going to the Philippines simply because of what's available. If they actually go to the Philippines, is there anything that's actually available to them which have not been taken over by Filipinos, for instance, right? So there's that kind of thing. I think we might see this as happening only as the Philippine economy expands and grows, right? And I think to give the Duterte administration some credit, my suspicion is that when we talk about economic growth in the Philippines, during the Aquino administration, we were experiencing continuous quarters of growth. And the growth was, shall we say, not impressive, I think it was good. You're talking about anywhere between 6 and 7% during that time. Okay? We're still able to maintain that. Maybe there's going to be a slowdown at some point. But I think the problem is that we're now hitting the glass ceiling that, or the limitations that are imposed on us by the lack of infrastructure. Right? In other words, those things that the Build project is supposed to actually put into place, I think is important to the long-term prospect of continued and faster Philippine economic growth. So in that sense, I'm willing to give the Duterte administration some credit as far as that kind of strategic input is actually concerned. But what you can see is that even there, it's going very, very slowly, right? In other words, $24 billion of promised capital coming from China, or investments coming from China, and how much of that has actually entered the Philippines. In other words, it's still subject to a lot of bureaucratic problems, and in this context, the prospect of the Philippine economy expanding so that it becomes attractive to, say Indonesians or other Southeast Asians to actually come to the Philippines, it's probably something that we can see somewhere in the future, but those are my thoughts on the question that you asked.
We are hopeful though.
All right. I think that concludes our question and answer session. I would like to invite all the audience to give one more big round of applause to our... We are very grateful to have you here today and join us to hear a little bit about how things have been changing quote-unquote dramatic thing when President Rodrigo Duterte to be taking place as president, and how his decisions are actually placing the ASEAN policy at stake, especially concerning about how the Philippines is trying to raise normalcy in terms of the relationship between the Philippines and People's Republic of China. And we would like also to be thanking the audience that have been really participative in terms of maintaining the quorum, and also